Action combat is terrible for MMORPGs, and in this video, I'm going to explain why. Some of you are probably screaming at your monitors going, "Oh my god, action combat is great. The only reason you think action combat is bad is because you're bad." Well, unfortunately for you, I'm probably significantly better than you at all of these action combat games, and I have the receipts to prove it. I've played New World, Crowfall, and most importantly, the revered golden child of MMOs, Wildstar, at the highest levels, and this is all verifiable on my YouTube channel. Most importantly, with Wildstar, I was in the rank 1 raiding guild in the world, who later became Limit in World of Warcraft, while simultaneously being rank 1 in arena PvP at the same time. So to say that I'm bad at these games, I think is not really accurate. I've played all of these different action combat MMOs for thousands, tens of thousands of hours, and for the most part, I just don't think it's worth it. So let's break down all of the reasons why action combat sucks for MMORPGs. Number 1, it's just not hard. For the most part, these action MMOs are so lenient with the skill shots, because they have to be, that it doesn't really take much skill. There's really not that much of a difference between a super high skill player and a lower end player. You don't see accuracy differences really in these games. We'll get to New World here in a second, but for the vast majority of these action combat MMOs, there's just not that much skill expression to be had, because the hitboxes are so big, the hurt boxes are big, everything is very forgiving, so much so that really ranged combat in action MMOs just isn't hard. You would assume in an action combat game or an action game in general, the skill would be hitting the range shots, but for the most part, that's actually easy. The real skill in most of these action combat MMOs is playing a melee character and accurately mirroring another player's movement while also being aware of your surroundings. In my opinion, that was the hardest thing in Wildstar PvP, was being a melee, being fully aware of all your surroundings, looking at all your target debuffs and everything, while simultaneously just being inside of the other character's model, so if they dodged a certain way, you wouldn't lose uptime. That was the skill in action combat games. It's essentially tracking in FPS games, but instead of using your crosshair, you're using your player model to track the other player model. And I don't really feel like a lot of people play action MMOs or think of that as the primary skill mechanic in action MMOs, but it was. That genuinely was the highest skill expression you had in Wildstar at a medium to high level. Was how good are you at staying inside of another player's hitbox? How quick are you at reacting to their movement? That's kind of lame. Like, nobody was missing attacks outside of outranging somebody for a split second. Wasn't really happening. Nobody was playing an Esper and whiffing attacks, or, it just didn't happen. Number 2, you can't really dodge attacks due to latency, tick rates, server lag, and all of the things that have to happen on the back end for these games to function. There's just too much delay and latency for you to realistically move out of the way of an attack before it hits you. Now, there are games like Guild Wars 2 that essentially cheat this system by having iframes and lag compensation to where the damage is more delayed, so you get that illusion that you're dodging, but you're not really. There's just some server backend magic where the damage isn't calculated until a few hundred milliseconds later. It's a whole bunch of smoke and mirrors, and you ultimately have to make shortcuts for this to happen. The reason why you can't dodge is just genuinely because the tech isn't there, with people playing all over the world and the server and the lag. You just can't do it. Anybody that's played an MMO next to another person, like having two computers next to each other and both of your characters are in the world together in the same spot, and you hit spacebar on one computer and wait you see how long it takes for the other character to jump on your screen. The delay is crazy. And even if you're playing with low latency, the tick rate of the server is probably incredibly low. So when you think of Valorant, I think Valorant plays on 120 hertz servers. The server gets updated 120 times a second. It might be 144. It's high. MMOs play on 4 tick rate, actually 4. World of Warcraft back in the day used to, I think, batch every 250 milliseconds, something like that. So we're talking the server gets updates 4 times a second. You're just not going to have the kind of responsiveness. And even if you double that, triple that, whatever, it's still not going to be snappy enough to have genuine movement-based dodge that's not being cheated by the server with some trickery and smoke and mirrors. Before we go any further, we need to address the people losing their minds in the comments section right now, going, what about New World? What about BDO? Those are action combat games with projectiles and dodge rolling and real skill. Man, those games got it right. Well, I hate to break it to you, but no, they didn't. So let's go back in time to New World's launch. New World, anybody that has been playing these MMOs long enough, when New World hit beta and we saw that they had real headshots in PvP, like real-time headshots and projectiles and this amazing action combat, a lot of the normies were just blown away by this. But anybody that's played these games long enough was like, either Jeff Bezos and his pile of money has solved the laws of physics. He just threw enough money at the light speed problem and they figured it out, or there is an insane amount of client-side trust happening in games like New World and BDO. Well, it turns out there was a lot of client-side trust in New World. Like, a lot. Like, hardly any server checks, which is why you were able to have this really cool, snappy, responsive combat, because the server just believed everything you did on your client. So naturally, as New World developed, you could just do crazy exploits, speed hacking, dragging your window. Like, the server believed everything your client said. So there were crazy exploits where people would just minimize their game and drag the window around and be immortal because the server did no checks. This later turned into the game having aimbots with the musket, which is that's not really that surprising that somebody would make a musket aimbot. But then we had speed hacking, just flat out speed hacking for a long time. Apparently it's still going on, where you just have people running around doing crazy stuff, swinging their axe really fast. And then the craziest thing I saw was you had auto projectile hits. You had aimbots for projectile weapons, which you're kind of scratching your head like, okay, I can see a musket aimbot because it's just kind of point and click, it's hit scan. But there were aimbots for projectile weapons that would function by telling the server, you hit that shot. So the server was just like, well, this guy's just really damn good with the ice gauntlet. He's just hitting every shot. He's really good with the bow. He's hitting every shot. He led that shot perfectly because the server didn't actually check. The server just believed everything the client said. So, unfortunately for New World, there are a lot of people complaining that the combat is not as good as it used to be. It's just not as responsive. It's laggy. It's choppy. What happened? Like, they ruined the one good thing this game had? Yes, they did, because New World never actually really had good combat. They just cheated and hoped they weren't going to get caught. They hoped people weren't going to hack the game and figure it out and exploit it. But that's what you get when you don't do server-side checks. New World was egregious. I mean, I love New World combat. It was fun. I played the game. I loved it. Well, I liked it for a while. You know, how the typical New World story. Let's not get carried away. But, you know, when I was playing the musket, I was like, whoa, this is kind of cool, dude. That's really cool. I like that you have to lead your shots and stuff, but I knew it was short-lived. Next up, we have the insane amount of server and client calculations that have to be done to run an action combat MMO at scale. Now, these games usually function pretty good when it's like 5v5 or, you know, you're out in the world by yourself. The games run good because there's not that much going on. But when you start bumping up the player count even a little bit, the server and client calculations just get crazy. It's so much more work for both the server and the client to resolve all of these action combat skills than it is for a tab target. When the majority of your things are tab target, it's just, there's a lot less going on for the server and for other people's clients to have to do. That's why none of these games run well. It has nothing to do with your system. It has nothing to do with, you know, Amazon, or it's not because all of these game companies just can't optimize the game. That's not what's going on. It's just that this is like difficult. This is a very difficult thing to do at scale. There's just a lot of, it's an exponential problem. Going from 1 to 2 players is much easier than going from 49 to 50 players. If you know how this stuff works on the back end, the more players you add, the exponentially harder it gets and the more calculations you have to do. And with action combat, it's already hard. So they just don't run well. The games just don't run well. Next up, we have readability and the dumb factor. Let's be honest, even if these large-scale fights in these games did run well at 60 frames a second, flawless, with no lag, they'd probably still be stupid. There's just too much going on. There's too much going on for these action combat skills to really matter. You can't read what's going on because it's just a light show. Even if they made a conscious effort to make them more readable and make the battlefield just not so crazy, I just don't think the skill shots and like the dodge rolling and all of these very granular mechanics would hold up at scale. I just don't think these games ultimately hold up at scale. New World, individual mechanics, I really feel like kind of go out the window a lot when you get into wars. You know, these dueling legends in New World. Like if you watch somebody that's playing like rapier bow dueling outside of the town and you see what he's doing and you're like, whoa, that's wild, man. It's crazy. People are so good. It doesn't translate to wars. It just doesn't, because it's just too much going on, too much stuff, too much craziness, and it just doesn't play right, look right, feel right. And in reality, the game is lagging like shit anyway. Next up, we need to talk about healing. Healing in action combat games is usually pretty dumb. There's usually a few stupid things that have to be baked in for healing to work at all and for healing to feel right. A lot of the times there are healing skills that heal the person you're targeting and yourself. You just always heal yourself for free randomly. A lot of your heals are AoE because they kind of have to be. There are a lot of concessions that have to be made for healing to work well. A lot of your heals are just circles that you put on the ground and people have to stand in. You have a lot less freedom for designing abilities when you have to cater it all to action combat. There's also a lot of weird design things that have to take place where you have to balance your heals around the fact that you can't target yourself, but you also need to sometimes heal yourself, but there's no way for them to do that because there's no targeting because it's an action game. So you have to somehow balance your single target heal that heals this guy and yourself. There's just so many hurdles you have to jump over because there isn't actual targeting. New World, which didn't have a targeting system, decided that they needed a half-assed targeting system when it came to healing, where you would scroll through your party frames to target people with your single target heals. It was terrible. I think everybody would have rather just had normal targeting than do this weird half measure with scrolling. Absolutely bizarre. I think healing just in general is one of those things where you just need targeting. You can't have all the heals be AoE. And some people might be saying, why don't you just have like a single target aimed heal? Well, the problem is that it doesn't really scale because you need to be healing groups. And for the most part, it's very difficult to heal a single person in a group. Like if you're healing a raid fight, like a raid boss, you need to heal the tank. There's probably a whole bunch of people in the way of the tank. So that kind of stuff, it just doesn't work at scale. It's very annoying and frustrating. So ultimately, they just make all the heals AoE for the most part. With all the healing being AoE, it means that the meta strategy in a lot of fights is going to turn into death balls. Everybody has to stay clumped together because that's the only way you can really receive healing. And it's the best way to stay safe. So you just end up having all of the fights being big balls of players being very tight-knit, just smashing into each other, and it becomes a laggy, unreadable mess where you feel like as a player, you just can't really contribute much because it's so chaotic. Like your own personal skill in those situations just doesn't matter because it's just such an unreadable, chaotic, laggy mess. Next up, we have balance. With these action combat games, not only are a lot of the healing skills AoE, a lot of the DPS skills are AoE, and that makes balancing them very difficult. Wildstar had a problem with this, where you had a skill like Warrior Rampage, which was 5 targets, had to get knocked down to like 3 and then 2, because there are skills where, especially melee, where it feels good for it to cleave, right? It feels good for you to be able to hit multiple people, but how do you make impactful abilities that can hit multiple people, not like crazy overpowered because they can hit multiple people? How do you make unique, interesting things that all of them are AoE, it becomes very difficult. You really box yourself in when you're an action combat game where you can shotgun and hit everybody. How do you do it and keep it balanced? Another thing with healing, how do you make like a big like rescue heal that, you know, really saves somebody and tops somebody when it can hit like 5 people at once and all potentially yourself, because you can't target yourself and you need to heal for yourself, right? Man, you really box yourself in when it comes to balance with everything being AoE. Next up, we have accessibility. All of these high twitch action combat games are going to really require you to have a pretty good internet connection. You're going to want a low ping, because when you have that low ping and the server lag and your client lag and all the other things, you need that ping to be as low as it can be. And unfortunately, a lot of these games are not accessible to people that aren't from developed nations, like people from Australia that have 300 ping. The game, it really narrows down what they can actually play, because as I said previously, a lot of the skill in these action combat games is effectively mirroring melee movement. It's just being in melee range is the skill of the game. It's effectively tracking other player movement with your character. And if you are on 300 ms ping, that becomes really impossible for some situations. There were a lot of people that didn't play a Stalker in Wildstar because they had less range, they were melee, and you just really had a hard time doing that if you had higher ping. So they would play range classes, and they'd have no issue with range classes because, believe it or not, range classes in action combat games don't really take that much aim. It doesn't really matter if you're off like a lot because it's just not hard in general. So, yeah, the games just become not really accessible. So the real question is, why the hell are we doing this in the first place? The illusion of skill? For the most part, all of these action combat systems are not the primary determining factor of how good a player is. In Wildstar, in Crowfall, the good players, when I would look at a good player play, I wasn't like, wow, this guy's like really hitting all his shots. He's the next tens. Like, it's just not really a thing. So it just doesn't seem like the juice is worth the squeeze. It seems like a targeting system in MMOs really opens up the game design and the types of abilities you can make. It also solves a lot of edge cases. Wildstar, the golden child of action combat MMOs, had a targeting system. A lot of people forget this, but Wildstar had target frames. It had a tab target system because there were a lot of edge cases where you actually just needed to target a person to do a thing. It just was a thing that needed to happen, and even though most of the skills didn't really need to do it, you still needed to for some of them. Now, I will concede with action combat, it is very nice when you're in a low stakes environment. Like, let's say you're by yourself and you're grinding mobs. It's nice not to have to specifically target things or tab target. It's nice to just kind of kick back and, you know, aim at stuff and, you know, point, click, shoot. Like, it's very intuitive. It's nice just playing and not having to deal with target frames. Sure. And that's where I think that Ashes of Creation is pretty smart with what they're doing with their toggleable crosshair soft lock system, to where if you're just by yourself doing a low stakes activity, go ahead, put it in action combat mode. Don't have to deal with targeting. It's very intuitive. You know, face this way swing, face this way shoot. It works. And it's soft lock, so you don't, you know, it's basically it's just another way of tab targeting where you're not having to actually deal with the tab or clicking. It's nice. So I think that's a very good middle ground. So if you couldn't tell by now, I think that tab targeting is by far superior to action combat. But that doesn't mean that I don't think action combat abilities have a place in tab target MMOs, because I absolutely think they do. I think that having a few action combat abilities adds to the combat. It makes those particular abilities have a lot of weight, and they feel chunky and awesome because they are fundamentally different than the other abilities. And I think that this is actually more impactful than having everything be an action combat ability. When you have a few skills that really stand out and really feel impactful, I think it feels better than everything being that way. A perfect example of this done right, in my opinion, is the Evoker from WoW. The DPS Evoker in particular has a few action combat skills revolving around the Dragon Breath, like the Deep Breath and the Shotgun Breath, whatever it's called, that I think are done very well. They are high impact. They feel good. I think that is how you do it right. Shockwave, where it's like a cone, you hit multiple targets. I think that having a few of those abilities is worthwhile because they feel good. They don't murder the server. You're not having to make weird edge case concessions, but having every skill be like that, I think it really corners the developers and forces them to have to make a game that's really boxed in because there's just a lot of constraints with everything being action. And there are so many edge cases that are solved by having target frames. A ton, trust me. That's why Wildstar had target frames, is for those edge cases. Anyway, that's it for me. Hopefully the New World and BDO crowd isn't too angry with me. I'm sorry to shatter your illusion of your extremely high client-side trust games. It's a shocker there are so many hackers and exploits. Who'd have thought? But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Have a good one. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to subscribe with notifications on. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and join the Discord. It's free.